Welcome to Billionaire Romance Tales, where love, fate, and second chances collide. Before we begin, drop your city in the comments, and when you're done, rate the story to tell us how it made you feel. Now relax and enjoy this one's. A ride. Manila's heat pressed down like a hand that wouldn't lift. Exhaust rippled over the avenue, turning buildings into wavering mirages. Margaret Oliva tucked a worn manila envelope tight to her chest, the last crisp copy of a resume that had been smiled at, skimmed, and set aside 4 times since breakfast. The lobby of the insurance company felt like a trap disguised as a blessing cool air, polished stone, the soft hush of wealth. She fixed a stray strand of hair back into her braid and stepped to the desk. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked, voice bright as glass. "No," Margaret said, careful with her smile. "But I brought my resume. I'd like to apply." 10 minutes later, an HR associate with kind eyes and the same rehearsed speech slid the paper back across the table. "We require at least 2 years' experience for this role. Truly." "Sorry." Margaret thanked Hershey, was very good at thanking people who closed doors, and stepped back into the noon glare. Jeepneys rattled past, hawkers called, and the city's pulse thudded in her ears. At a tiny eatery, she bought the coldest bottle of water they had, catching herself just before she asked if they took cards. Right? Account frozen. Coins. Only 5. "Interviews on my list," she told herself. "To down, 3 to go. Keep moving." The advertising agency looked promising. Clever logo. Glass facade, indoor plants that looked watered by people who cared. Inside, she sat across from a man who read her resume like a weather report. Strong communication, community volunteer work. 3rd-year undergrad. He tapped the line and sighed. "Our opening needs 3 years of experience. If you finish your degree and get 1 year in the field, come back. I mean that." She folded the paper back into the envelope gently as if it were a bruise, and walked out to a bench under a coconut tree that offered more suggestion of shade than shade itself. The envelope felt heavier than a page of bullet points should. She spun it in her hands and whispered, "Don't cry, not here." Her phone showed a balance that could cover 3 days of groceries and a week of fear. She looked up and caught her reflection in the tinted window of a parked SUV. Neat blouse, practical shoes, a woman who'd learned to smile with only half of her mouth. "One more," she said aloud. "I've got 1 more in me." At the jeepney shuddered to a stop outside a block of glass that seemed to inhale the sun. Fulkerson Prime Realty. Silver letters, perfect edges, the kind of lobby that made you feel underdressed no matter what you wore. Margaret swallowed. "'Kay, last chance." She didn't move. Her legs, sturdy all morning, turned to wet paper. There was a time she'd slipped into places like this without thinking, when air conditioning and a barista were just part of the day. That time had ended with her family business and her tuition. Now, buildings like this looked like they might check IDs and bank statements at the door. "Miss, are you all right?" She turned. A tall man in a blue polo and dark trousers stood, a step back, giving her space. He had the posture of someone the world listened, 2 shoulders squared, chin easy, eyes that didn't fidget. Not movie star pretty, decision made pretty. Sorry," she said. "Just gathering myself. Come." "Inside," he said, as if it were obvious. "Heat will flatten you. Do you work here?" she asked, following him into the cool. His mouth tugged, almost a smile. "I'm Kaiden." A beat. "Fulkerson." Blinked at the letters on the wall and back at the man walking like the marble knew his step. The CEO. Her heart did something. Unprofessional. "Please don't let me take your time," she said. "Already rehearsing a retreat?" "Time is all this lobby has," he replied and kept moving. HR saw her quickly because CEOs bend time. The conversation was efficient and soft around the edges, like a pillow with a rulebook inside. "We require 2 years' experience," the manager said, tone regretful. "Can't place you just now." "Of course," Margaret said. Smile was steady. The corners of her eyes were not. She stepped back into the lobby, where the air hummed expensive, and found a couch too soft for a woman who'd trained herself to sit on hard things. She held out for 3 breaths. Maybe 4. Then the sleep she'd been avoiding all week sidled close with friendly arms. The hum, the cold, the relief her head tipped back. The world dissolved. When she woke, a woman in a tailored dress debro was leaning down with a sympathetic smile. Ms. Oliva. Mr. Fulkerson would like a word. Of course he would. Margaret smoothed her braid, brushed invisible crumbs from her skirt, and followed. His office didn't try to impress. It tried to think. Glass on 2 sides. A desk that looked carved from a single decision. The city spread out like a map nobody could own. You fell asleep in our lobby, he said, tone neutral. Yes, I'm sorry. I was unprofessional. She stood straighter. I'm having a long day. So I gathered. He gestured to a chair. Tell me about it, she told him. The morning, the rejections, the eatery, the agency. She didn't explain the frozen account or the tuition or why the word experience felt like a wall built out of polite bricks. He watched her like an engineer watches wind tracking force and direction. Our assistant roles support projects that shouldn't be learning on the job, he said finally. We don't throw trainees into those, I understand. She folded her hands to keep them from showing the tremor in her chest. If there's clerical work, mailroom, anything, I'll show up early. I'll learn fast. I just need one person to say start. He studied her a beat longer, then set her envelope down with careful fingers. What do you need right now, he asked. Not theory? Reality? The question reached straight under her ribs. Rent, she said, because honesty sometimes slips out when you're too tired to dress it. Food, and if I'm lucky, school again. He nodded once. I can offer something. A pause that rearranged the air. Not employment. Her throat went dry. Then what? An arrangement, he said, and the word landed between them like a blade laid flat. Companionship. Discretion, your time. I'll take care of your needs. In return, you take care of mine. For a heartbeat, she heard the city outside horns, a whistle, laughter that wasn't for her. Inside, the air thinned. Do you always do this? She asked, because questions were armor. No, he didn't flinch. Sometimes I remove obstacles. You're at one. Near the bulldozer, she murmured. This time the smile reached one eye. If you like. Everything in her told her to stand up and walk out with dignity intact and hunger unchanged. But images ambushed her. A fridge with milk. A power bill paid on time. A classroom lit by noon sun, and a professor who knew her name. She heard her mother's hum in a memory that tasted like rice on a Sunday. I need to think, she said, voice small but whole. Good, he replied. Think. If you agree, we put it in writing. No commitment. No public overlap. Clear boundaries. Want out, you say the word. And if you want out, say the word. No apology. Only the shape of the deal. She set her palms on her knees and felt the fabric of her skirt. The chair under her. The hum of a building that belonged to other people. I need air. So do I, he said softly, surprising them both. They took the elevator down in silence, standing a polite step apart. The lobby was still cool, still citrus, still indifferent. She faced the sunlit doors and felt the future like a cliff edge coming up fast. Okay, she said finally, without turning. I'll try. The word felt like stepping onto a bridge that hadn't finished building itself. Cut to black. The apartment. Kaiden chose wasn't new. It had been waiting too long, the kind of place with curtains still folded from the last. Tenant and cupboards that exhaled a sigh of dust when you opened them. Margaret stood in the doorway. With a duffel bag and the contract she had signed only 2 hours earlier, the words arrangement, confidentiality, termination at will still echoed in her head. She wasn't sure if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life or the only choice left. Kaiden set the keys on the counter. Everything's covered. Utilities, groceries, whatever you need. Consider this neutral ground. Neutral. The word felt strange when spoken by a man who looked anything but. His presence filled the space like weather-calm skies hiding. Storms? He didn't linger. He pointed out the fridge, the card left on the table, the number for his driver. Then he left with the quiet confidence of a man used to doors opening. and closing when he walked through them. The silence after him was too large. Margaret set her bag down, walked barefoot across the cold tiles, and let her fingers trail along the counter. Is this survival or surrender? By evening, she had rolled up her sleeves and claimed the apartment in the only way she knew, cleaning. The dust motes rose like confetti in the sunlight as she swept, mopped, and wiped surfaces until her arms ached. She arranged the utensils neatly, folded the towels, and put her resume copies in the drawer beside the bed, her reminder that she hadn't given up on work. Not entirely. When she finally sat down, the bracelet Kaiden had fastened on her wrist. Earlier that day glinted in the dim light. Silver. Simple. With a star-shaped charm. She hadn't taken it off. She told herself it was because she didn't want to seem ungrateful. But deep down, she admitted she liked the weight of it. A reminder that someone, even if for complicated reasons, had noticed her. The first week Eden didn't ask for much. In fact, he didn't ask for anything beyond presents. He would text her with details as dry as business memos. Tuesday, 7 p.m. dinner. Friday, 9 p.m. drive. Sunday, walk. She went more out of curiosity than obligation. Each time, he was careful, almost distant. He held doors, ordered food, asked about her day, but didn't pry. If he wanted more, he never showed it. One night, during a quiet dinner at a rooftop restaurant, she finally asked, "Why me?" He stirred his glass before answering. "'Cause you remind me of something I forgot." "What's that?" "That hunger can be dignity, and dignity can be beautiful." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time she saw a crack in his armor, a man who had climbed so high he had forgotten the ground until she reminded him it existed. The flight, their first trip, came sooner than she expected. "Cebu," he said one afternoon, "I have meetings. Come with me." She hesitated. Am I just arm candy now? But the thought of 4 walls and silence made her nod. The airplane lifted them above clouds painted gold by the sun. Margaret pressed her forehead to the window, eyes wide like a child seeing magic for the first time. Then back at his laptop, but she noticed the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. At the Temple of Leah, she couldn't stop looking around, at the carved lions, the marble steps. The sky stretched wide like possibility. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He watched her, not the statues. "It is." Then he reached into his pocket. "Hold out your wrist." "Out," she frowned, but obeyed. The cool brush of metal kissed her skin as he fastened a delicate bracelet with a tiny star charm. "You don't have to give me things," she said softly. "I don't give gifts," he corrected. "I mark beginnings." Her chest tightened. She didn't know if it was fear or hope. Maybe both. The first kiss that night, in the quiet of the hotel room. Desire stopped being a shadow. Kaiden's hand brushed hers as they stood on the balcony, the city lights flickering below. He didn't move closer at first, just let the silence breathe between them. Then, carefully, as though asking a question, he leaned in. She could have stepped back. She didn't. His lips met hers, warm, steady, not greedy, not demanding. She surprised herself by responding, fingers curling in his sleeve. It wasn't about the arrangement anymore. It wasn't about survival. It was about the ache of being seen, the relief of being wanted. When he pulled back, he searched her eyes. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she breathed, though her heart pounded like a fist against a locked door. Later, when they finally crossed, the line they had both pretended wasn't there. She laughed nervously afterward, covering her face. "Do you always schedule this too?" "Only when it matters," he said, adjusting his shirt cuffs, and she threw a pillow at him, laughing harder than she had in months. "The trial on there last night in Cebu," he spoke as they walked along the waterfront. The air smelled of salt and grilled food. Children's laughter skipped over the sound of waves. "Let's try it," he said suddenly. "Try what?" "US. 6 months. A trial run." She blinked. "You schedule feelings, don't you?" He smirked faintly. "I like structure." "If it doesn't work, then we go back to the way things were. No blame, no debt." She looked out at the sea, the moonlight tracing silver over the waves. 6 months, she thought. Half a year to see if my heart can remember how to beat. All right, she said finally, a small smile breaking through. 6 months. He didn't say anything, but when he took her hand, his grip was firmer, surer. For the first time, it felt less like an arrangement hand, more like the beginning of something neither of them could name yet. The city's rhythm hadn't slowed, but Margaret's body had begun to betray her at first. It was just nauseous sharp, sudden, brushing her ribs in the early mornings. She blamed spoiled milk, cheap coffee, exhaustion. She told herself she was just tired, just nervous, just adjusting to the strange new chapter she had agreed to. But as the days ticked past, the symptoms refused to leave. On the 4th morning, truth whispered louder. She found herself curled on the bathroom tiles. The cool ceramic pressed against her cheek as she waited for the world to stop spinning. The toothbrush clattered forgotten by the sink. Her chest heaved. And then, like lightning through fog, she understood. Her hands trembled as she slipped into a small pharmacy, who'd pulled low as though secrecy could disguise biology. Rows of colorful boxes stared at her choices she had never thought she'd have to make. She picked one, clutched it to her chest like contraband, and hurried home. The instructions were simple. The seconds that followed them were not. Margaret sat on the edge of her tub, staring at the test in her hand. She whispered to herself, nonsense words, prayers, fragments of her mother's voice long gone. The world felt suspended, as if all of Manila had paused to watch what line would appear, and then it did 2 lines. Clear, unapologetic. She exhaled a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. She thought of her late parents, of her aunt's scolding voice, of the lectures she'd abandoned when tuition fell through. She thought of Kaiden, his precision, his unreadable calm, his ability to shape cities with signatures. She thought of herself and the child inside her, and how the algebra of her life had just rewritten itself. She put the stick back in its box, hands trembling as though she were handling explosives. Then she reached for her phone, the confrontation. Office was designed to intimidate, but Margaret had walked through too many slammed doors that day to feel small. She stood straight, holding her breath until her voice came. I'm pregnant. The words detonated between them. Kane didn't move for a moment. His gaze fixed on her, pupils sharp, as if the sentence were a contract he needed to scan line by line. He set down the pen he'd been holding and leaned back, hands clasped loosely in front of him. Are you sure? His tone wasn't dismissive. It was the voice of a man who demanded clarity before building skyscrapers. Yes. Her voice was steady now. I took the test. Twice. Okay. A silence stretched long enough that she heard the faint hum of the city. Beyond the glass. Finally he spoke. Then we adjust. That was Kaiden. 2 words, heavy as steel beams. His response, I'll support you, he said. Housing, doctors, finances, whatever you need. It was what she had expected, and yet it still made her heart ache. The sentence was correct, responsible, logical. But it wasn't what she had secretly hoped to hear. I'll support you was not the same as I want this child with you, she forced herself to nod. Thank you, he rose, as though movement could help both of them breathe. Come with me. There's somewhere you should stay. The empty house he drove her across the city to a gated property she had never seen before. House loomed quietly, its modern design softened by disuse. When he unlocked the door, the air inside smelled faintly of dust and time. This is one of mine, he said simply. It's safe. Private. You'll be comfortable here. The living room's bare furniture looked more like staging than home. Margaret stepped inside slowly, fingertips brushing along the mantel as though introducing herself. It was a place waiting for life. She spent the next day scrubbing, opening windows, coaxing the house to breathe again. The rhythm of cleaning was familiar, grounding. By evening, she had transformed it into something livable. Fresh sheets on the bed, curtains pulled back to invite the sun, the faint scent of lavender detergent softening the edges. And yet, as she folded Kaiden's spare shirt in the laundry, her heart snagged. On the collar a faint lipstick stain, her chest tightened. It wasn't a surprise. Not really. They had never promised each other fidelity. This had begun as a transaction. But seeing it a scarlet echo of another woman's mouth made her sit down hard on the cold tile. For a long while she stared at it, emotions twisting in silence. Then, with deliberate hands, she threw the shirt into the wash. The machine churned, swallowing the evidence. She told herself it was better not to think about it. Nightfall that night, Margaret lay in bed with her palm pressed gently against her stomach. Her voice was soft, meant for the tiny heartbeat growing within her. "We're okay," she whispered. "I don't know if we're happy, but we're okay. And for now, that's enough." She closed her eyes, the bracelet on her wrist glinting. Faintly in the moonlight, somewhere in the silence of the house, the future stirred, certain, but alive, fade to black. The house had grown warmer with every passing week. Curtains that once sagged in silence now fluttered with the baby's kicks in Margaret's belly, as though the wind itself celebrated life. But no amount of cleaning or sunlight could prepare her for the moment pain arrived like a tidal wave. It began at dawn. Margaret doubled over near the kitchen sink, a glass of water shattering at her feet. She clutched her stomach, gasping as another contraction seized her. Sweat gathered on her forehead, and her breath turned ragged. She fumbled for her phone, barely managing to call Mary, the only friend she trusted with her secret. "It's time," she whispered. Within minutes, Mary's car screeched to a halt. Outside the house, Margaret just breathed. The delivery, the hospital's fluorescent lights carved the night into harsh slices of white. Nurses rushed her through double doors while doctors barked instructions. Margaret clutched the rails of the bed as though they were the only solid thing. In a world unraveling, every contraction tore through her like a storm splitting the earth. Her cries echoed down sterile halls, yet her spirit clung stubbornly to survival. Sweat drenched her hair, her blouse, her very soul. "Push, Miss Oliva, one more push." Time became elastic. Seconds stretched into eternities, then snapped. Back with the piercing wail of new life, the baby's cry shattered the ceiling of her pain and rebuilt it into joy. Margaret collapsed back, tears spilling down her cheeks. The nurse lifted the tiny wrinkled miracle and laid him on her chest. His warmth was fragile, but real, heavier than any diamond she had ever seen. "My baby," she whispered. "We made it." Kaiden arrived skated and entered late, his tie askew, his usually perfect hair mussed by hands that had pulled too hard. He stopped cold at the sight. Margaret, pale but glowing, cradling the newborn. For a moment, his practiced composure cracked. He took a single step forward, then another, as though approaching something sacred. His voice caught. "Ours." Looked up, exhaustion softening her features. She nodded. "Ours." The word built a bridge over a canyon he hadn't realized he'd been standing on the edge of. He reached down, touching the tiny fist that curled instinctively around his finger. The weight of that grip undid him. Cadanmen of contracts, of numbers, of decisions carved in glass and steel, laughed through tears he didn't bother to hide. "He's perfect." New rhythms, the days that followed blurred into a strange symphony. Margaret recovered slowly, her body bruised but her heart impossibly full. She sang lullabies she didn't know she remembered. She marveled at tiny fingers, delicate breaths, and eyes that blinked as though curious about everything. Kaiden surprised himself. The man who once ruled boardrooms with icy efficiency now wrestled with diapers as though they were puzzles designed by enemies. He leaned over bassinets at 3 a.m., whispering numbers and soothing nonsense just to keep the baby calm. He was clumsy. He was awkward. But he was there. And every time his son gripped his finger, he swore silently that this fragile, miraculous life was more valuable than any empire he could build. The house had finally started to feel like a home. Margaret learned the rhythm of nights broken by soft cries, mornings scented with warm milk, afternoons colored by the fragile laughter of her son.
Ow.
She no longer flinched at the silence in the halls because now, silence meant the baby was sleeping soundly. Kaiden came and went like the tide. Meetings, conferences, late-night calls. Yet somehow, he always returned with diapers in one hand, groceries in the other, a look of exhaustion hidden behind sharp suits. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but he was present more often than she ever expected. For a while, Margaret let herself believe in this new rhythm. The call had happened on a Thursday night. Kaiden was on a conference call in his study, the baby asleep in Margaret's arms in the next room. She hadn't meant to overhear, but the door was slightly ajar, and his voice carried. "Yes, the project's on schedule. Don't worry. And as for the gossip, ignore it. She's just a janitor who got lucky." The words cut through her like glass. Margaret froze, her breath caught in her throat. The baby stirred faintly, sensing her heartbeat racing beneath his tiny body. She kissed his forehead, whispering "It's okay," though nothing was okay, just a janitor. Yeah, lucky. It didn't matter that he hadn't meant it for her ears. It didn't matter that his tone had been dismissive rather than cruel. The words lodged in her chest, heavy as stone, dragging every insecurity back to the surface. The departure, she didn't confront him. She didn't shout or cry or demand an apology. Instead, she packed quietly at dawn, her movements precise and deliberate. Diapers, bottles, a few clothes. She wrapped the baby in a soft blanket and pressed one last kiss to his forehead. By the time Kaiden rose from bed, the house was silent. Too silent. The crib was empty, the drawers half open. Her bracelet, the silver star he had once clasped on her wrist, lay neatly on the nightstand. Kaiden's chest constricted as realization hit. Called her name, checked every room, then grabbed his phone and dialed her number again and again. Straight to voicemail. Panic swallowed his composure whole. For the first time in years, Kaiden Folkers, master of deals, conqueror of boardrooms, felt utterly powerless. The search, he tore through the city, checked the hospital, her favorite cafe, the tiny park where she sometimes walked the baby stroller. Nothing. Finally, he called his old friend Jack, his voice raw. "She's gone. She took the baby." There was silence on the other end then. Jack's low voice. "Maybe you should ask yourself, why?" Kaiden gritted his teeth, but the words sank in like a blade. He had given her money, shelter, security. But he hadn't given her the one thing she needed most. Respect. And now she was gone. Kaiden sat in his office long after midnight, the city lights flickering like restless thoughts outside the glass. His tie hung loose, his shirt collar open, but none of it mattered. The house was empty. Her absence rang louder than any boardroom. Silence he'd ever endured. His phone buzzed. Jack, loyal, blunt, the kind of friend who didn't polish truths. "You found her yet?" Jack's voice was steady, but edged with something Kaiden recognized. Disappointment. "No," Kaiden admitted, rubbing his temples. "Everywhere I look, it's like she's vanished. She won't answer my calls. She left the bracelet. Jack, she took the baby." There was a pause. Then Jack said quietly, "Do you even realize what that child means?" Kaiden frowned. He's my son." "No," Jack corrected. "He's your miracle." Past resurfaced. Jack's words dug up memories Kaiden had tried to bury. Under contracts and skyscrapers, years ago, sitting in a sterile doctor's office, he'd listened as a specialist explained the truth. "You're infertile. The chances are next to none." Back then, Kaiden had folded the paper with the test results, slid it into a drawer, and buried himself in work. He never told anyone, not his father, not his board, not the women who passed through his life like seasons. Children, he decided, simply weren't part of his story. And yet, here was a child. His child. He remembered the weight of the tiny fist curling around his finger in the hospital, the fragile breath against his chest, the way Margaret's eyes had shone with exhaustion and fierce joy. If the doctors had been right, then what he held that night wasn't just blood or biology. It was something rarer, a miracle. The realization, Kaiden's chest tightened until he had to stand, pacing the office like a caged man. He had reduced Margaret to labels, to circumstances, to a convenience. he could control. He had called her just a janitor, when in truth she was the strongest woman he had ever known, someone who carried both rejection and new life in the same body, who faced the world's indifference and still dared to love. He pressed his palms to the desk, breath ragged. I've been blind. Blind to her worth. Blind to what she gave me. Blind to what this child means. For the first time in years, Kaiden felt small, not weak, but human. The decision the city would wake in a few hours, demanding meetings, signatures, decisions. But Kaiden knew there was only one decision that mattered. Now, he didn't care if it meant chasing Margaret across provinces, begging in front of strangers, throwing away the cold armor he had built around himself. He would do it because this wasn't about deals or arrangements anymore. It was about family, about the miracle he had been too blind to see. He grabbed his phone, dialing Jack again. Help me find her, he said, voice steady now. As my assistant, not as my friend, as my witness. Because when I do, I need her to know she was never just anything. Rain streaked across the windshield as Kaiden's car pulled up in front of a modest apartment above a bakery. Warm light spilled from the windows, the kind that promised safety but not extravagance. He hesitated at the curb, his heart pounding. Harder than any boardroom negotiation, inside, Margaret rocked the baby gently. The smell of fresh bread drifted up through the floorboards. Mixing with the soft sound of lullabies, she hummed without noticing. She looked tired, but there was peace in the curve of her shoulders. A peace Kaiden had never given her. A knock broke the moment. 3 measured raps, too deliberate to be the baker's delivery boy. Her chest tightened. She rose slowly, laying the baby in his crib, then crossed to the door. When she opened it, Kaiden stood there, drenched from the rain. His usually perfect composure cracked and raw. Margaret, he said, voice low, heavy. She didn't move aside. You found me, never stopped looking. His eyes flicked. Passed her to the crib, then back. Can I come in? She hesitated. Every instinct told her to slam the door, to protect the fragile sanctuary she had built. But her heart betrayed her hand. She stepped aside. The apology of the apartment was small, humble, but warmer than any of his penthouses. Kaiden looked strangely out of place among the mismatched furniture and family photos pinned to the fridge. I heard what you said that night, Margaret began, her voice steady though her throat burned. Just a janitor who got lucky. That's all I'll ever be to you, isn't it? Kaiden flinched as though struck. I was wrong, he said simply. Those words, God, Margaret, they weren't truth. They were cowardice, habit, a man too afraid to admit what you mean to him. She folded her arms, holding herself. Respect. That's all I ever wanted, not your money, not your contracts. Just respect. He stepped closer, his voice breaking. Then hear this with every ounce of respect I have left. You are the strongest person I've ever known. You carried life when the world gave you nothing. You made a home out of emptiness. And you gave me his breath caught. You gave me a son when the doctors told me I could never have one. Margaret's eyes widened. What? Kaiden nodded, the confession heavy. I was told years ago, can't father children, but here he is, our son, not by my biology, but by something greater. A miracle you gave me. The choice the words hung in the small room, weaving into the scent of bread and the soft breaths of their child. Margaret felt the ground tilt beneath her. I don't know if I can trust you again, she whispered. You don't have to not today, Kaiden said, but let me earn it. Let me prove that I'm more than my mistakes. I don't want an arrangement. I don't want convenience. I want a family with you. Silence stretched. Then, from the crib, the baby stirred, letting out a small cry. Margaret moved instinctively, lifting him into her arms. The child blinked up at her, then at Kaiden, tiny hands reaching. For the first time, Margaret saw something in Kaiden's eyes she hadn't before. Vulnerability. Not the mask of a CEO, not the cool certainty of a billionaire, but a man stripped bare, willing to beg if it meant keeping his family. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders softening. One chance, Kaiden. Just one. You break it, and we're done forever. He nodded, tears burning at the edges of his gaze. I won't waste it. Margaret stepped closer, placing the baby gently in his arms. Kaiden cradled his son like treasure, as if afraid he might vanish. His smile trembled, but it was real, and in that moment, mid-rain, bread. And fragile forgiveness, their fractured world began to stitch itself back together. The next weeks were clumsy, chaotic, against all odds beautiful. Kaiden moved into Margaret's small apartment above the bakery, not the other way around. The billionaire who once slept on Egyptian cotton sheets now folded himself onto a couch too short for his frame, his long legs dangling awkwardly. He didn't complain. When Margaret raised an eyebrow, he just smirked and said, "It builds character." The first lessons, the baby was the best teacher at 2 a.m. When his cries split the night, Margaret stirred out of habit, but Kaiden was already on his feet, fumbling with bottles. The first attempt ended in disaster. Formula powder. On the counter, milk too hot, a red-faced infant who refused the bottle. Margaret chuckled softly from the doorway. "You're supposed to shake, not stir," she teased. "I build skyscrapers, Margaret," he grumbled, trying again. "How hard can a 4-ounce bottle be?" She walked over, guiding his hands. "It's not about precision, it's about care." When the baby finally latched and quieted, Kaiden looked down at the tiny face and whispered, "There we go. My little miracle." Margaret's chest tightened. For once, the words weren't businesslike. They were tender. Small steps every day brought new challenges. Diaper duty left Kaiden covered in talcum powder, his expensive shirts permanently stained. He ruined 2 loads of laundry before Margaret banned him from touching the washing machine. He tried cooking breakfast and nearly set off the smoke alarm. But he kept trying, and slowly. Margaret realized this wasn't the same man who once dismissed her with careless words. This was someone willing to look foolish, to be wrong, to learn. After noon, she found him sprawled on the floor with their baby, making ridiculous airplane noises as he lifted the giggling child into the air. The sight was so absurd, so human, that Margaret laughed until her sides hurt. Kaiden looked up, grinning. "Don't tell the board I do this. They'll think I've gone soft." "Maybe you have," she replied. "And maybe that's not a bad thing." The first argument, of course, it wasn't perfect. One evening, exhausted from the baby's colic, Margaret snapped when Kaiden suggested hiring a full-time nanny. "So you can go back to work and forget about us?" she accused, voice sharp. Kaiden stiffened. "That's not what I meant. I just want to help." "Help." She shook her head. "Sometimes it feels like you think money is the only help you can give." The silence after her words cut deeper than shouting ever could. Kaiden left the room, pacing the hallway. For a long moment, Margaret feared he might walk out altogether, but then he returned, sat beside her, and said quietly, "You're right. I don't know how to do this, but I want to learn. Just don't shut me out when I fail." Her anger softened into something like relief. She reached for his hand. "Then don't shut me out either." Their fingers intertwined. A fragile promise, but a promise nonetheless. Building trust over time, Kaiden began rearranging his life. He turned down late-night meetings. He silenced his phone during dinner, even showed up to a quarterly board review with spit up on his suit jacket, shrugging off the raised eyebrows. When his father questioned the changes, Kaiden answered firmly, "My family comes first now." Margaret overheard and felt tears sting her eyes. The first time, she believed he meant it. A new kind of wealth one evening. As the sun set in hues of orange and violet outside their window, Kaiden held the baby in his arms, while Margaret leaned against his shoulder. "You know," he murmured, "I used to think success was measured in square footage and profit margins. But right now," he kissed the baby's forehead, "right now I feel richer than I ever have." Margaret smiled softly. "That's because you finally understand what can't be bought." Kaiden turned his head, meeting her gaze. "We're him, us. That's the only wealth I want to protect." And in that small apartment above the bakery, among the smell of bread and the sound of tiny breaths, Margaret allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was what home felt like. The invitation had arrived in the most predictable way. A call from Caden's father, formal and cold. Bring the boy, and whoever is raising him. Caden had clenched his jaw but agreed. Margaret, hearing only half of the conversation, felt her chest tighten. Are you sure this is a good idea? Caden turned to her, his voice firm. They need to see us. To see you, to see our son, not as rumors, not as shadows, yes, as family. The mansion, the Fulkerson estate, was everything Margaret wasn't. Marble steps that echoed too loudly, chandeliers dripping with light, paintings of ancestors staring down with practiced disdain. Margaret smoothed her dress with trembling fingers. As she carried the baby, Caden reached for her hand, squeezing it briefly. Breathe, he whispered. At the long dining table, his father sat like a judge. The silverware gleamed, the air thick with expectation. When Margaret entered, the room hushed, the weight of stares pressing against her skin. The confrontation Caden's father broke the silence first. So this is the arrangement. His eyes flicked to Margaret, then to the child in her arms. A distraction you chose to parade into my house. Margaret's cheeks burned, but before she could reply, Caden's voice cut through the tension. She's not a distraction, he said sharply. She's the woman I love, and she's the mother of my son. The declaration landed like thunder. Forks paused midair. One of Caden's uncles coughed uncomfortably. His father's expression hardened. Love, don't be naive. You risk everything, our name, our legacy for this? Girl. Caden straightened, shoulders squared. Legacy means nothing if I have to abandon my family to keep it. The words stunned the room. For the first time, Margaret saw not just a businessman, but a man choosing sides, and choosing hers. Aftermath, the dinner limped along, it's awkward and cold. Margaret barely touched her plate, focusing instead on keeping the baby calm. Caden stayed close, his hand resting reassuringly on her back whenever the glares grew sharper. When they finally left the mansion, Margaret exhaled in relief, the night air crisp against her skin. I'm sorry, she whispered as they walked to the car. I didn't mean to cause trouble between you and your father. Caden stopped, turning to her. His eyes were dark, but steady. Don't apologize. I would rather burn every bridge in that house than let them treat you as less than what you are. Margaret searched his face, half expecting hesitation, but there was none. His conviction was real. It warmed her more than any chandelier ever could. The drive home silence stretched between them in the car. But it was a different kind of silence, one filled with unspoken promises. The baby slept peacefully in the back seat, oblivious to the storm they had just weathered. Margaret leaned her head against the window, then quietly asked, Do you regret it? Caden glanced at her, his grip tightening on the wheel. Not for a second. And in that moment, she believed him. The storm didn't come from the boardroom or the mansion. It arrived in stilettos. Clara Monroe, a name Margaret had seen only once before, lipstick on Caden's collar, washed away in silence. She appeared at the lobby of Fulkerson Prime Realty. One afternoon, cameras flashing as though she'd summoned them. A model turned socialite, Clara carried herself like a woman used to winning. Her smile sharp as glass. Caden, she purred when he stepped out of the elevator. It's been too long. The staff exchanged nervous glances. Margaret's photo had already circulated in tabloids, headlines whispering CEO's mysterious companion. And now Clara was here, looking every inch the woman who fit more neatly into that world. The private confrontation, Caden agreed to speak with her in his office, if only to avoid spectacle. Clara crossed the room as though she still owned part of it, her perfume cloying in the air. You've been busy, she said, eyes glinting. A child? With her. Caden's jaw tightened. Yes, with Margaret, my partner. Clara laughed softly, shaking her head. Partner? Caden, she doesn't belong in your world. She'll drag you down. But me, she stepped closer, fingertips grazing his desk. I've always understood your world, and I can give you the alliances, the access, the respect you need." For a moment, Kaiden stared at her, the weight of his past pressing against the man he was trying to become. Then he said, firmly, "Respect isn't given by society. It's earned by love. And I already have mine." Lara's smile faltered. "Brittle, you'll regret this," she hissed, before storming out. Margaret learns that evening. Margaret found the story splashed across online tabloids. Clara seen visiting Kaiden Fulkerson at HQ. Her chest sank. Old fears resurfaced, whispering that she would never be enough, that Kaiden would eventually realize he belonged with women like Clara. It's not her. When Kaiden returned home, she held the baby tighter, her voice trembling. Why was she there? Why did you let her in? Kaiden sat opposite her, exhaustion etched across his face. "'Cause if I hadn't, she would have made a scene. But hear me. Margaret, she means nothing. Not anymore. You and our son are my family. Nothing else matters." Margaret searched his eyes. This time, she found no hesitation, no shadows, just conviction. Still, trust was fragile, and wounds didn't close overnight. She nodded slowly, whispering, "Then prove it." Prove it. Quiet resolve later that night. As Margaret finally drifted to sleep, Kaiden stood by the crib, watching his son's tiny chest rise and fall. His reflection stared back at him in the window half, the man he used to be, half the man he wanted to become. He whispered into the dark, more to himself than to the baby, "I'll prove it. To her, to him, to myself. I won't let anyone take this away." The night held no answer, only the soft hum of the city. But Kaiden knew this truth. Clara's return wasn't the real test. The real test was proving day after day that love could outlast doubt. December wrapped the city in glittering lights and the restless hum of carols. Streets overflowed with children, chasing sparklers, vendors selling bibinka, and families huddled together under strings of glowing lanterns. Margaret stood at the window of their small apartment, cradling her son. The baby's wide eyes reflected the lights outside, as if even he could sense the season's promise. Behind her, Kaiden zipped up a duffel bag stuffed not with contracts or files, but with toys and food parcels. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. Kaiden looked up, his suit traded for a simple sweater. "More sure than I've ever been. Tonight isn't about profit margins. It's about giving." The outreach they drove to a small community shelter in the outskirts of Manila. Children with worn shoes and hopeful faces gathered as volunteers arranged tables of food and baskets of second-hand clothes. Margaret carried the baby close to her chest, while Kaiden, awkward but determined, knelt down to hand a toy car to a wide-eyed boy. "Merry Christmas," Kaiden said. The child's smile gap-toothed, pure, unfiltered, hit him harder than any deal ever had. Margaret watched from a distance, her heart swelling. This was not the Kaiden she had first met, cold, untouchable, draped in arrogance. This was a man humbled, transformed by love. Kneeling in the dirt to bring joy to a child who had nothing. The family moment later, under a makeshift canopy of Christmas. Lights strung across bamboo poles, Margaret and Kaiden sat side by side, their baby nestled between them. Volunteers and families sang carols, voices imperfect but alive with warmth. Margaret leaned her head on Kaiden's shoulder. "You've changed," Kaiden exhaled, his gaze fixed on the little one sleeping peacefully. "No. I think I finally found the part of me I lost chasing everything else." He turned, meeting her eyes. "You gave me this, Margaret. And him. You gave me back my soul." Her throat tightened. She pressed her lips to his cheek. "Merry Christmas, Kaiden." "Merry Christmas, love." A new kind of miracle as the night deepened. They walked hand in hand back to the car, the baby bundled in a soft blanket. Around them, children laughed, bells rang, fireworks painted the sky in bursts of red and gold. For the first time, Margaret felt no doubt, no fear. Just peace, and Kaiden, slipping his arm around her, realized that the empire he had spent a lifetime building could never compare to the fragile, infinite wealth of this moment. Family, forgiveness, and love. It wasn't just Christmas. It was their miracle. The new year dawned with polished shoes and sharp suits. At Fulkerson Prime Realty, whispers filled the halls about $1 billion merger, the kind that could shape the skyline of Manila for decades. Caden's board was relentless. "This is the deal of a lifetime," one executive insisted during a late-night meeting. "But it requires you in New York for 6 months. Face-to-face, hands-on. 6 months." An ocean away from Margaret and their son Kaiden leaned back in his chair, the weight of responsibility pressing against his chest. Once, this would have been his dream. Now it felt like chains, the pressure that night. He sat at the kitchen table of their apartment, a folder of documents spread before him. Margaret placed a steaming cup of tea beside his hand, her eyes searching his face. "You're quiet," she said. He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "They want me in New York. Half a year, maybe longer." The words dropped like stones. Margaret's hands tightened around her robe. "And what do you want?" Silence stretched. He wanted to say the deal. He wanted to say the empire. But when? He looked up. He saw their son crawling clumsily across the floor, giggling as he reached for a toy. "I don't know," he admitted. The conversation later that night, with the baby asleep, Margaret sat across from him. "Kaiden, you have to decide. If you go, you'll give them everything they want. But what about us?" He met her gaze, guilt swirling in his eyes. "This is who I've always been, Margaret. The man who builds, who expands, who never stops. Moving forward," but now his voice cracked. "Now I don't know if that man fits into the life I want with you." Margaret reached for his hand. "Then maybe it's time to ask yourself, what's worth more, a skyline or a family?" Temptation. The next morning, Kaiden stood at the window of his office, watching the city stretch beneath him. The temptation whispered, "Go. Sign the deal. Be the man you were born to be." But another voice, quieter, goaded in his chest. "Stay. Be the man they need you to be." His reflection in the glass looked back at him, torn between two versions of himself. For the first time, Kaiden realized this wasn't just about a choice of work versus family. It was about who he truly was, and who he was willing to become. At home that evening, Kaiden returned earlier than expected. Margaret looked up from the sofa, surprise in her eyes. "Didn't you have meetings?" she asked. "I canceled them," he said simply, lowering himself beside her. He picked up their son, who squealed with delight, and held him close. "I'm not leaving. Not for 6 months. Not for 6 days. If they want the deal, they'll take it on my terms. Otherwise, it isn't worth it." Margaret's breath caught. "Are you sure?" Kaiden kissed the baby's head, then looked at her. "I've built enough towers of glass. Now I want to build something real." And in that simple declaration, Margaret knew the war between his past and his present had found its victor. The city's skyline glittered that night, but Kaiden's eyes weren't on the towers. They were on Margaret, standing on the rooftop garden of their modest apartment, her hair lifted by the breeze, their son giggling in her arms. Dinner had been simple takeout boxes, laughter over spilled soup. It's a kind of evening that would never make headlines, but etched itself into memory. Yet Kaiden's chest carried a weight, one he could no longer hold. He cleared his throat, hands fidgeting with something in his pocket. "Margaret," she turned, smiling faintly. "Yes." His voice faltered, then steadied. "When we met, I made you an offer, cold, calculated, a contract dressed up as care. I thought money could solve everything." He stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers. "But you showed me that real wealth isn't written in numbers. It's here, in you, in him, in us." Margaret's breath caught. Kaiden dropped to one knee. The world seemed to still, sirens fading, traffic hushed, even the wind holding its breath. In his hand, a small velvet box opened to reveal a ring, not gaudy but timeless. A single diamond that caught the city lights. "I don't want an arrangement anymore," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want a promise. Marry me, Margaret, not as my companion, not as my obligation, but as the love of my life, as the mother of my son, the woman I can't imagine tomorrow without." Tears welled in her eyes. She looked down at their son, whose tiny fingers clutched her blouse. Then back at Kitten, the man who had once been a fortress but now knelt vulnerable before her. For a heartbeat, the world balanced on silence. Then she whispered, "Yes." Kaiden exhaled a laugh, relief flooding his face as he slid the ring onto her finger. Margaret dropped to her knees, too, wrapping her free arm around him as their son squealed between them. Under the Manila night sky, amidst lights and laughter and tears, the Fulkerson family was born not out of contracts or convenience, but out of love. The day dawned clear, the sky painted in soft blues and gold. Manila seemed to hold its breath as cars lined up outside a small cathedral, humble compared to the skyscrapers Kaiden once worshipped, but filled with warmth and light. Margaret stood before the mirror in the bridal suite, her gown simple yet elegant lace traced her shoulders, the skirt flowing like water. She barely recognized herself, no longer the girl rejected at interviews, no longer the woman surviving on scraps of hope. She was radiant, carrying both her scars and her strength like a crown. Mary, her closest friend, fussed with the veil. "You look like you stepped out of a fairy tale," she whispered. Margaret laughed softly. "If you told me 2 years ago this would be my life, I would have thought you were crazy." She glanced at the tiny star bracelet still on her wrist. First gift Kaiden had ever given her. She had chosen to wear it today, a reminder of how far they had come. The ceremony of the cathedral bells chimed as Margaret walked down the aisle, her son toddling ahead as the world's most unsteady ring-bearer. Guests chuckled softly, wiping their eyes at the sight. At the altar, Kaiden waited in a tailored suit, nerves hidden behind a smile that belonged to no one else but her. When he saw Margaret, his chest tightened. This wasn't just a wedding, it was redemption. The vows were simple, unpolished, but real. "I once thought love was a weakness," Kaiden said, voice trembling. "But you taught me it's the only strength worth having. I vow to protect you, to respect you, and to choose you every day, no matter what storms come." Margaret's tears shimmered as she replied, "I once thought I wasn't enough. But you showed me that love doesn't ask for perfection, only truth. I to stand with you, to build with you, and to believe in us always." When they sealed it with a kiss, the crowd erupted in applause, bells ringing in harmony with their hearts. The celebration, the reception was not the lavish ballroom affair the Fulkerson family had once demanded. Instead, it was held in the courtyard of the community shelter where Kaiden and Margaret had handed out gifts at Christmas. Children ran between tables, music floated in the air, and laughter replaced the usual drone of networking conversations. Margaret danced barefoot under the string lights, her gown brushing the ground as Kaiden twirled her clumsily, both of them laughing like teenagers. Their son clapped along to the music, toddling into Kaiden's arms mid-song, forcing the dance to pause but making the moment perfect. Guests whispered that it was unlike any wedding they had seen, too simple, too raw. But for Margaret and Kaiden, it was everything. It wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about legacy. It was about love, family, and the miracle of second chances. The sun rose gently over the city, brushing golden light across rooftops and waking streets. In a quiet home, far from the noise of boardrooms and mansions, Margaret stirred awake to the sound of small feet padding across the floor. Their son, now walking confidently, climbed onto the bed with a grin. "Mama, Papa." Kaiden groaned playfully, pulling the boy into his arms and tickling him until giggles filled the room. Margaret watched, her heart swelling with gratitude. The man who once measured life in contracts now measured it in moments. Like this. A changed man later that morning. Kaiden sat on the porch with his son on his lap, showing him how to fold paper planes. "Throw it with the wind," he instructed, his voice soft. Patient qualities no one in his corporate empire would have believed possible. Margaret leaned against the doorframe, smiling. This was the same man who had once called her just a janitor. And yet, he was also the man who had chosen to kneel, to apologize, to change. People in the city still whispered about them, about the CEO who married a woman from nowhere. But to Margaret, those whispers no longer mattered. Their truth was louder. Building together months turned into years. Kaiden didn't abandon his empire, but he reshaped it. Board meetings ended earlier. Weekends were sacred. His company funded new shelters, scholarships, programs for children who once had nothing. Whenever the press asked what inspired the shift, Caden's answer was always the same: my wife and my son. They taught me what success really means. Margaret, meanwhile, returned to school part-time, determined to finish the degree she had once been forced to abandon. Caden supported her every step, proudly attending her graduation with their son, cheering from the crowd, a family's legacy on their wedding anniversary. Caden brought Margaret back to the rooftop where he had first proposed. String lights twinkled. The city stretched endlessly below, and their sun ran circles around them. Laughing, Caden slipped his arm around her shoulders. Do you ever think about how it all began? A rejection? An offer? A mistake? Margaret chuckled softly. And somehow, it became everything I never knew I needed. He kissed her temple. No contracts, no conditions, just us. Margaret smiled, leaning into him forever. The message as the night settled. Margaret whispered a quiet prayer of thanks for hardship that shaped her, for love that surprised her, for a family built not on wealth, but on forgiveness and hope. Their son pointed at the sky, where a single star blinked brighter than the rest. Margaret touched the bracelet still on her wrist, the silver star charm catching the light. She remembered the girl who had once walked into a job interview with nothing but an old envelope. And she smiled. She was no longer that girl. She was a wife, a mother, and a woman who had found her worth. And together, they walked into a new dawn.